At 1 o'clock, the BBC News, now on BBC One Wales, with Reeta Chakrabarti and Nick Savini.
The Prime Minister vows to end catastrophic costs for social care users in England and invest in the NHS after COVID, with controversial plans on how to pay for them. Boris Johnson says national insurance will rise by 1.25% and the tax on share dividends will also go up by the same proportion.
Yes, I accept that this breaks a manifesto commitment, which is not something I do lightly, but a global pandemic was in no one's manifesto.
As the Prime Minister said, the rise in NI represents a breach of a Conservative manifesto promise. We'll bring you all the latest from Westminster, also this lunchtime. Shots are fired by Taliban fighters in the Afghan capital, Kabul, to disperse hundreds of protesters, many of them women. Police Scotland admits failures which materially contributed to a young woman's death following a car crash 6 years ago. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is to set out her government's programme for the next year, including plans for an independence referendum. And the rise of a new star in British tennis as 18-year-old Emma Raducanu smashes her way through the US Open.
In Wales today, fresh concerns about the care of babies at a hospital where maternity services have already been criticised. And millions are disposed of every day. We're with the Welsh firm recycling face masks.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The Prime Minister has announced a long-awaited package of funding for the NHS and Social Care in England, accepting accusations that he has broken an election promise to do so. Speaking in the Commons this lunchtime, Boris Johnson said that COVID had placed massive pressures on the NHS and that national insurance contributions will rise by 1.25% from next April to help the NHS and also the care system. The rise in NI, which is opposed by Labour, is highly controversial among Mr Johnson's own MPs, as the Conservative manifesto had pledged not to raise taxes. There's also to be a rise in the tax on share dividends of 1.25%. Here's our political correspondent, Iain Wells.
It's haunted successive governments. How to fix social care so thousands of people don't end up selling their homes to pay for it. Sharon's mum sold her house to fund her staying at a care home for her dementia, but that money has now run out.
I will find that money, but I must admit, I would only hope that Mum doesn't live too long, because otherwise I'd be bankrupt as well.
We love NHS and Social Care. Brilliant.
It was one of Boris Johnson's first promises as Prime Minister, that he'd fix the crisis in social care with a clear plan he'd prepared.
Fix the social care crisis.
More than 2 years later, he's presented a plan to his ministers and a tax rise to go with it, breaking one promise they were all elected on.
Which taxes are you putting up?
The answer? National insurance, which will rise by 1.25% to raise billions for the NHS COVID recovery and social care reform in England.
It would be wrong for me to say that we can pay for this recovery without taking the difficult but responsible decisions about how we finance it. As a permanent additional investment in health and social care, it would be irresponsible to meet the costs from higher borrowing and higher debt.
Labour haven't set out their own alternative, but they and some Tory MPs think this is the wrong way to cover the costs.
The pretence that the Prime Minister is only here because of the pandemic is not going to wash. He's putting a sticking plaster over gaping wounds which his party inflicted. He made that commitment on social care before the pandemic, and he said he would pay for it without raising taxes before the pandemic.
The tax rise is UK-wide, but the plan is England only. Other nations can set their own and will get extra funding too. In England, the plan is no one will have to pay more than £86,000 for care in their lifetime. Anyone with assets less than £20,000 will have their care costs fully covered by the state. It's a version of a plan proposed by Sir Andrew Dilnot, who advocated a £35,000 cap on care costs in 2011.
Right now, the absolute crisis is that the means-tested system that provides support for those who can't look after themselves and don't have any assets and income that they could use to pay for it is on the verge of falling over. People who desperately need care aren't getting care. We need to sort that.
Well, it's very complicated.
Politically, it is. Many Tories are troubled by breaking an election promise not to raise taxes. But tying reform of the care system to more cash to help the NHS recover from COVID will make it harder for critics to vote against. Critics also fear this tax rise will fall disproportionately on the young and less wealthy. But could this be balanced by another promise that's expected to be broken, ditching the so-called triple lock that protects how much pensions increase by? The Prime Minister's keen to be seen to be the one that gets this done, despite the fallout. Whether these bets will pay off politically or be enough to fix the social care crisis remains to be seen.
Iain Wells reporting there, and we'll be speaking to her shortly. But for the time being, I'm joined by our social affairs correspondent, Alison Holt. Alison, so money for the social care sector. When will the sector see any of it?
Well, Reeta, there's a lot of detail we still need to work out on this, but let me give you the big picture. I won't be able to answer all those questions just yet. But over 3 years, starting from April of next year, the health and care levy will raise £36 billion across the UK. Of that, 5.3 billion will be allocated to social care. And that money, we're told that less than half of that money will be needed in those 3 years for the cap, that limit on care costs, and the changes to the means test. So the rest of the money will be invested in the rest of the system. So 500 million, we're told, will go on workforce and skills development, and also on extra money will go on increasing the rates that councils pay for care. Now, this is to deal with the issue which causes a huge amount of upset and resentment, and that is where people who fund themselves end up paying more to subsidise those who are being cared for with council help. The third area that we're told money will go into is increasing what they describe as integrational quality. And I think what that means is it's about how the health service and the care system can work together much more closely and efficiently.
OK. Thank you very much. Alison Holt reporting there. Well, we can go back now to Iain Wells, who is in Westminster for us. And Iain, so there's a plan, a long-awaited plan, a means of funding it, but it's controversial because it involves a manifesto pledge break.
That's right, and even the Prime Minister admitted in the House of Commons that the Conservatives don't like breaking manifesto pledges, don't like raising taxes, and this isn't something that he or any of the other parties wanted to do necessarily. Now, he said that they had to break this manifesto pledge because of the pandemic and they didn't have a choice for that. That hasn't really washed with the opposition, with Labour saying that this is a sticking plaster over a problem that's been caused by the Conservatives. Now, in terms of this plan that's been announced, the Prime Minister has said that the NHS needs this money to cope with the massive impact of COVID. Now, just to sort of recap what the plan is that's been announced, care costs in England are going to be capped at £86,000, meaning that no one is going to need to pay more for that for their care. Anyone with assets less than £20,000 will receive care for free. People with assets between £20,000 and £100,000 also have their care subsidised. Now, the controversial bit, of course, of this is the fact that the way it's going to be paid for is through a 1.25% increase on national insurance contributions, but also an increase on tax on share dividends. Now, the increase on national insurance contributions is going to eventually end up on our payslips as something called a health and social care levy. Now, this is something that I think government ministers are hoping will make that kind of criticism a little bit easier to ride out, because wrapping up the social care crisis with more funding for a big NHS catch-up means slightly harder for critics now to vote against it when everyone acknowledges that the NHS needs a huge amount of funding to cope with the backlogs of the pandemic.
Iain, many thanks. Iain Wells there at Westminster. And there will, of course, be live coverage of the Prime Minister's press conference on the BBC News channel this afternoon, where he'll be joined by the Chancellor Rishi Sunak and also the Health and Social Care Secretary Sajid Javid. That's at 4 o'clock. Well as today's long-term funding announcement for both social care and the NHS, the Prime Minister said yesterday that there'd be an extra £5.4 billion for the health service in England for the next 6 months to help tackle the backlog caused by the pandemic. This morning, MPs have been hearing from patients describing how their treatment was delayed as the NHS focused on COVID. Our health correspondent Catherine Da Costa reports.
Behind the record waiting list figures are the human stories. Michael needs a triple heart bypass. In the last few weeks, his operation's been cancelled 4 times.
They'd got you all prepared, hadn't they? And got you in the gown and said you'd be down in the theatre for 9:30. And then near lunchtime, they came and told him that it wasn't because it had been cancelled again.
I'm not half the person I was, am I? No, I've got no get up and go like I had before.
The impact of the pandemic on the NHS has been unprecedented. It's led to thousands of non-urgent operations being postponed, and that's seen waiting lists in England shoot up to 5.5 million. The Prime Minister's pledged to give the NHS what it needs. An extra £5.4 billion will be spent over the next 6 months responding to the COVID crisis in England and tackling waiting lists. With many hospitals already under pressure, experts told a committee of MPs they're worried an increase in COVID patients and a bad flu season could mean a difficult winter to come.
The news about the £5.4 billion funding is fantastic news, but let's be under no illusions. This winter is going to be remarkably hard, and it's going to impact waiting lists probably more than anywhere else.
There had been reports of a possible October lockdown if COVID hospital admissions continue to rise. But the Department for Education was quick to tweet news of a firebreak was untrue. While vaccinations have helped reduce pressure on the NHS, the fallout from COVID is huge. Experts say there could be 8 million missing patients who are yet to come forward for treatment, making the task ahead enormous.
If 75% of those missing patients, as it were, reappeared, you'd have to spend in total around £17 billion. I will say that again, £17 billion. That would equate to needing just over 18,000 more nurses and over 4,000 more consultants to get through that backlog.
Health experts say what's needed isn't just more money and extra staffing, but a well-thought-out recovery plan that will be needed for many years to come. Catherine Da Costa, BBC News.
Shots have been fired by Taliban fighters in the Afghan capital Kabul to disperse hundreds of protesters, many of them women. They were demonstrating against Taliban rule and in support of rights for women. Video footage from the scene shows people running to safety while heavy gunfire can be heard in the background. Our correspondent Sikandar Kamani has sent this report from Kabul.
Death to Pakistan, the crowd chant. They're furious at what they believe is the country's support for the Taliban, including, they allege, in taking over Panjshir, the last province to be captured by the group.
Pakistan has directly attacked our country. We don't want Pakistan to announce the government here. Afghanistan is a free country. We women and men are not the same as those 20 years ago who were being whipped into submission.
But Pakistan says the Taliban are Afghan. It's got nothing to do with them.
I accept the Taliban are Afghans, but behind them is Pakistan. They gave them this ideology.
Pakistan says it's always worked for peace in Afghanistan. Taliban members initially appear to allow the protesters to march through the city.
This is the biggest challenge to the Taliban's authority that we've seen so far, and it's not coming from a militia force, it's coming from peaceful protesters, from both women and men.
And amongst the protesters, some not afraid to directly criticise the group.
We demand freedom of speech, democracy, national resistance against the Taliban.
Aren't you afraid?
We are not afraid of death. We are the young generation and will bring the bud of freedom. Our voices will make history.
As the protests continued, convoys of Taliban vehicles made their way to the scene. Eventually, fighters fired shots in the air to disperse the crowd. Dissent is not something the Taliban are used to. Sikandar Kamani, BBC News, Kabul.
The Home Secretary is said to be furious at the number of migrants crossing the Channel by boat. Yesterday, 740 people made the journey, the second busiest day on record. Earlier this summer, the government agreed to pay France an extra £54 million to help them step up border patrols. But Priti Patel says she's considering withholding some of that money if the French fail to prevent more crossings. Simon Jones reports now from Dover.
The latest arrivals in Dover, brought to shore this morning by the Border Force after the flimsy boat they're on was spotted mid-channel by a passing ferry in the world's busiest shipping lane. Yesterday, hundreds of people made the crossing. The lifeboat had to be drafted in to help as the authorities struggle to cope with the numbers. The Dover MP is demanding action.
It's just outrageous, and we need to have immediate and fresh action to bring an end to the small boats crossings.
On Monday, around 740 migrants succeeded in reaching the UK by boat, the second busiest day on record. It brings the total this year to more than 13,000 people. Although the numbers using this route are growing, in the past year, asylum claims actually fell by 4%. The reason we've seen a big increase in numbers is down largely to the weather. For the past couple of weeks before that, it had been pretty gusty in the Channel, and that meant crossings were pretty much impossible. As a result, hundreds of people had been waiting in Calais for the right moment, and yesterday that came. At a meeting with concerned Conservative MPs last night, the Home Secretary is said to have threatened to withhold the millions of pounds promised to the French to try to stop the crossings.
Well, I think Priti Patel and I can both agree on being furious about the number, but probably for different reasons. We don't think anybody should be risking their lives making this crossing. The fact is that the French take far more than their fair share of people seeking asylum. We need to do a lot more, and we have to offer people better options, not keep throwing money at the French to keep people on that side of the Channel.
The French authorities say patrolling 60 miles of coastline to try to stop boats setting off is challenging, and attempting to turn them back once they take to the water is too dangerous. But the Dover MP insists it can be done. This is an issue that requires international cooperation, but it's one that's putting the entente cordiale to the test. Simon Jones, BBC News, Dover.
The time is 17 minutes past 1, our top story this lunchtime. The Prime Minister vows to end catastrophic costs for social care users in England and invest in the NHS after COVID, with a manifesto-breaking plan for a 1.25% increase in national insurance and tax on share dividends.
Yes, I accept that this breaks a manifesto commitment, which is not something I do lightly, but a global pandemic was in no one's manifesto.
In Wales today, it's already been at the centre of a damning report into maternity services. Now fresh concerns about the care of babies at Prince Charles Hospital in Merthyr Tydfil. And millions are disposed of every day, where with the Welsh firm recycling single-use face masks.
Now, how to save the planet while also keeping the lights on? That's a question which is dividing opinion on the Shetland Isles. Islanders are split over whether a proposed oil field off their coastline should be given approval. But some environmentalists are even more concerned about a new wind farm which is currently being built. Our correspondent James Cook reports.
Here on the idyllic edge of the UK, trouble is brewing. Just over this horizon lies the Cambo oil field. 800 million barrels, which climate campaigners say should stay in the ground.
Should we stop drilling in these waters now? That's the question facing Shetland, and in a way it's the question facing all of us. Are we really ready to power the modern world without oil and gas?
There is no point in stopping production of oil and gas where we can control it in the UK to see it being imported from outside the UK. I think it's not feasible to flick the switch overnight in terms of that oil and gas. We can't turn it off overnight and have the renewable energy there, because quite frankly the renewable energy is not there.
It is coming though. This huge new wind farm called Viking will send electricity from Shetland to mainland Scotland for the first time.
Yes, we've
massively benefited from oil and gas over the past decades, but we are sitting on a wealth of natural resource, and we really should lead by example here and look for ways to transition to cleaner energy without creating new oil fields or drilling for new oil.
But critics worry about the industrialisation of Shetland.
If you had to choose between Cambo drilling for oil and this wind farm, as an environmentalist, what would you choose?
As an environmentalist, I would still choose Cambo. Viking Energy is not a green answer. Cambo is removing oil, fossil fuel, from the ground. But Viking Energy, in order to get their turbines up, they're displacing the peat, which is a fossil fuel.
Viking Energy say they are restoring far more peatland than they disturb.
The carbon payback of this project, taking all those things into account, will be less than 2 years. We have a vast renewable energy resource in Shetland, and the whole world is moving to carbon net zero. Shetland needs to play its part.
Modern Shetland was built on oil. The proceeds paid for this swimming pool and 7 others. But now these beautiful islands are torn about when and how to give up their grimy golden goose. James Cook, BBC News, Lerwick.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon will reveal her government's programme for the coming year in a speech to MSPs this afternoon. She's expected to focus on pandemic recovery and her determination to pursue another independence referendum. While our political correspondent David Wallace-Lockhart is in Glasgow for us. And a significant speech then, David.
That's right, Rita. It's the programme for government, which is essentially the Queen's Speech equivalent at Holyrood, and it's the first one we've had since the SNP and the Scottish Greens entered a power-sharing agreement at Holyrood to form the Scottish Government. Now, Nicola Sturgeon is going to focus on economic recovery from COVID, but she'll stress the importance of doing that in a net zero fashion, i.e. making it environmentally friendly. We'll also hear about plans to extend free childcare to Scots who are on the lowest incomes. When it comes to legislation for the year ahead, we could hear about more than a dozen bills when the First Minister addresses MSPs this afternoon, including one of plans to set up a national care service in Scotland. We should also hear about plans to legislate to reform the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier for someone in Scotland to change their legally recognised gender. And we're also anticipating a law to pardon striking minors convicted in the 1980s. Now, opposition parties are calling on the First Minister to focus on COVID recovery, not independence. But bear in mind the SNP and the Scottish Greens want a referendum within the lifetime of this Parliament. She's probably going to have to say something about that.
OK, David, many thanks. David Wallace-Lockhart there reporting. A senior doctor in Belfast has warned that bodies would start piling up in Northern Ireland if more people do not get vaccinated. Northern Ireland is experiencing the highest infection rate of anywhere in the UK, but vaccine uptake is the lowest. Our health correspondent Marie-Louise Connolly gained exclusive access to Belfast City Hospital's intensive care unit for this report.
While life continues to move forward outside, here in ICU, there's been little let up.
Ready, set.
Turning or proning a critically ill patient can help them breathe. It requires many highly trained experts. These 7 COVID patients all require intensive care. One is in her early 20s.
Non-vaccinated, non-vaccinated. Only one of the patients has been doubly vaccinated. The rest are unvaccinated.
Physios attempting to remove secretion from a COVID patient's lungs. This time it doesn't work. The care is 24/7, it's all-consuming. It's a tense environment, but respect and dignity are paramount.
These are the faces behind the COVID figures that we report every day. Critically ill men and women, some are conscious of what's happening around them, many aren't.
And one-to-one nursing care, the gold standard for ICU, is no longer possible here, as staffing has been depleted.
The demand's insatiable, Marie-Louise. We're full. Both COVID and non-COVID intensive care unit is at capacity. In order to get patients in, we need to get patients out. The ward beds are as difficult to get as beds in intensive care due to the pressures that the whole trust faces.
When we filmed, this was the only available bed in ICU. Each morning, surgeons state their case as to why their patient should have it. Unfortunately, some surgeries were cancelled.
At the minute, we've just got one HDU bed and 2 patients that are looking for it.
And it could get worse. As well as COVID, a serious flu wave is also expected.
The bodies would start piling up, and they'd be piling up already without the vaccine.
Staff fear winter pressures have come far too early. Mary-Louise Connolly, BBC News.
The UK saw the lowest level of proposed job cuts for 7 years during the month of August, despite the government's furlough scheme coming to an end. The data from the Insolvency Service shows an 11% fall in planned job cuts in August compared to July, and suggests that the predicted surge in unemployment this autumn may be smaller than expected. The head of BBC News, Fran Unsworth, has announced that she's leaving the corporation after a career spanning 4 decades. She said it was time to hand on the job of leading the world's best news organisation. Fran Unsworth has started a significant reorganisation of BBC News to try to appeal to new audiences at a time of declining budgets, a process which has involved hundreds of job cuts. Police Scotland has admitted that a series of failures in its call handling system materially contributed to a young woman's death following a car crash on the M9 6 years ago. The force took 3 days to respond after the accident was reported by a member of the public. Well, our correspondent Alexandra Mackenzie is in Glasgow for us. Alexandra, remind us about this case and what the police are now saying.
Well, 25-year-old Lamara Bell was with her partner, 28-year-old John Yule. Now, they were travelling home from a camping trip when their car left the road and went down an embankment on the M9 near Stirling in 2015. A 101 call was made by a local farmer on that day, but we heard in court today that that call was not logged, no police incident was created, so no police action was taken. The court heard that John Yule was likely to have died at the time or soon after the accident. But Lamara Bell was conscious and able to communicate when the car was discovered 3 days later. She was taken to hospital but died 4 days after that. Now, the court heard that had she been discovered 6 to 8 hours after the accident and received treatment then, she would have in all probability survived with some long-term medical conditions. Now, the court also heard that the accident happened at a time of great transition for Police Scotland. They have apologised unreservedly to the families. Sentencing is expected this afternoon.
Alexandra, thank you. Scientists say dragonflies and their close relatives damselflies are spreading across Britain and Ireland as temperatures rise because of climate change. Some species, such as the emperor dragonfly, are moving northwards into Scotland from southern England and Wales and are also crossing the Irish Sea. British tennis is seeing the rise of a new star. Emma Raducanu's remarkable run at the US Open continues as she reaches her first major quarter-final. The 18-year-old beat the home favourite Shelby Rogers with ease, winning in straight sets in New York. While Laura Scott is in Roehampton at the headquarters of the Lawn Tennis Association for us. And Laura, real excitement now about Raducanu.
There really is, Rita. As you say, I'm at the National Tennis Centre, which has been a familiar training venue for Raducanu over the last few years. And I think what's really struck tennis fans and indeed former players is the sheer efficiency of Raducanu's wins. She hasn't dropped a set in 7 matches so far, and the aggressive play she's shown, even on the biggest stage of all.
Emma Raducanu.
Taking the tennis world by storm, Emma Raducanu's hitting new heights. Fresh from top A-level grades, she's moved on to tests of a different kind. And last night, inside the biggest tennis stadium in the world, she produced the best result of her life. Up against home favourite Shelby Rogers, who'd knocked out the world #1, Raducanu was outplayed early on. But at love 2, 15-40 down, Raducanu launched a startling comeback, reeling off 11 straight games to take her 1 game away from the quarter-finals. Time for deep breaths and cooling air. After just over an hour enthralling the Arthur Ashe crowd, a spot in the last 8 at a major was hers.
What a moment for Emma Raducanu.
To play Shelby, who's an American, and receive that much support and hear my name being chanted in the crowds, I couldn't believe it, and it meant so much, and I'm really, really happy and just super grateful to everyone out there.
Raducanu burst onto the scene at Wimbledon.
British tennis has a new star.
Making the second week before retiring with breathing difficulties in the 4th round. For the second Grand Slam in a row, Emma is the last British singles player standing, but the Lawn Tennis Association will take some comfort from the fact she's a success story for their scholarship programme, which is specifically designed to help young players break into the top 100. Emma's remarkable run in America will already see her jump to 74 in the world. Raducanu hasn't needed to look far for inspiration. Watching on from the front row, Virginia Wade, the last British woman to win the US Open, clearly impressed by what she'd seen.
Thank you so much for watching my match. I really appreciate it, and you're an absolute legend, so I'm really honoured to have had you here.
Grand Slams aren't meant to be easy, and Raducanu's next opponent is the Olympic gold medalist Belinda Bencic. That will be her sternest ever test. But just as Raducanu's fan base grows by the day, rightly too so does her confidence. Laura Scott, BBC News, Roehampton.
Time now for a look at the weather. Here's Chris Fawkes.
Hi Rita, and for most of us the afternoon holds more of these blue skies in store. Lots of sunshine on the cards, and it's getting hotter. Now this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon, the highest temperatures, the hot spots likely to reach 30 degrees Celsius. But why is our weather heating up right towards the end of summer? Well, it's all down to high pressure that's been with us for a few days, well, a couple of weeks actually, is now slipping away eastwards. As it does so, we're getting our winds coming up from the south around the edge of the high pressure, and that's dragging all this hot air from France across the UK, with that warmer weather progressively working northwards across the whole of the UK. And for many of us, the heat has already arrived, along with the sunshine for most of Northern Ireland, England and Wales. In Scotland, though, still a lot of cloud here, although we are starting to see some sunshine arrive at the moment across the central belt, and I think for most of Scotland it will tend to brighten up. Temperatures 24 degrees Celsius locally in Aberdeenshire, 24 for western counties of Northern Ireland, but the hot spots in England and Wales approaching that 30-degree mark. It will feel very warm, if not hot. Now, overnight tonight we'll keep the clear skies for the most part, but later in the night some mist and fog patches are likely to redevelop. Northern Ireland, Scotland most prone to seeing some of those. Temperatures 12 to 14 degrees Scotland and Northern Ireland, relatively comfortable, whereas further south for some in England and Wales, temperatures drop no lower than around 17, so quite a warm one. Tomorrow, more of the same for many of us with that sunshine on the cards. However, we're going to see some rain and some thunderstorms start to edge into the southwest of both England and Wales. And as that happens, some cooler air arrives. Temperatures here, high teens to low 20s. But for most of us, it's another hot day, getting hotter in Scotland. Temperatures in Glasgow reach 27. That's the peak of the heat, though, because on Thursday, low pressure is going to be moving in off the Atlantic, bringing weather fronts that will bring outbreaks of rain northwards across all areas, followed by a mixture of brighter spells and thundery showers. So the weather certainly turning wetter for quite a few of us, and the temperatures coming down as well, but it's still on the warm side. We're looking at highs of around 24, 25 degrees across eastern areas, high teens to low 20s across the western side of the country. Now for Friday, we've got more of this unsettled weather with a mixture of sunshine and showers affecting most parts of the UK. But on into the weekend, there are signs that the weather will try to settle down. The other thing that's worth noting through the weekend is across the northern half of the UK, it's going to get significantly cooler and fresher. So almost like we're transitioning from late summer to early autumn. Rita.
Chris, many thanks. Well, that's all from BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we now join the BBC's news teams where you are. Bye-bye.